There are actually important guidelines for recognizing authorship. And again, the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, has something to say about that. They say if you must be recognized as an author, you should have substantial input to one of the following. So this is the first requirement. Either you contribute to the conception and design, you contribute by the acquisition of data, or you contribute through the analysis and interpretation of data. So the first requirement is for one of these three. Okay? One of the three should be true or should be correct. But in addition to that, in addition to one of these three, an author must also have contributed to the drafting of the article or revising it for intellectual content. And there is a third requirement, final approval of the version to be published. Okay? Final approval of the version to be published. In other words, if I were to claim authorship of a paper, I should be in a position to say, if I see something wrong, I should be in a position to say, no, you cannot publish this paper as is. You have to correct it in this way. Okay? And if I disapprove of it, then it will not be published. Okay? So I should have so contributed that the other members of the team will be able to say that, or will be able to respect my decision about publication. Do you get the point? What that tells us is that there are two things to being recognized as an author. I have a slide later on about that. But the first one is contribution. There are two things. The first one is contribution, but there is a second one, which is responsibility. Okay? If you can say, I do not approve of publishing this now, that means your responsibility for the work is recognized. Okay? But we will have an elaboration some more about that. The following are not sole grounds for authorship credit. In other words, you cannot claim to be an author just because you acquired funding for the project. It seems so simple that it should not be the basis for being named as an author, but it will be difficult to resist if the one responsible for getting funding were to say, well, look, you could not have done this without the funding that I got for us. See? So there could be a real dilemma right there if the person who got the funding insists on being named as an author. Or the collection of data. The collection of data could also be a source of power because after I collect the data, I may not want to share it with you. If we were in the team together and I am responsible for collecting the data, I might say, oh, well, you have to promise that I will be an author. Otherwise, you cannot get this data that I have collected. Or general supervision. Okay? Again, the reason why the ICMJE puts this in the list is that it is so difficult to tell the supervisor, oh, I'm sorry, you cannot be one of the authors, right? Because of the simple reason that he or she is the general supervisor. Okay? Now, we looked at this case before. Okay, you remember this case of the surgeon who wanted to be recognized as an author, okay, because he contributed the tissue that was used. Okay? He thinks that his contribution is so important that the project could not have gone on without his contribution. Okay? Now, could he be considered as an author? If we look at the requirements again, we see that he could not be an author, right? Because you need input to the following: conception and design, acquisition of data, analysis and interpretation of data. And if we just cut the tissue and gave it as the subject matter for research, then that doesn't make him an author, right? But I was giving this example because we realize how important his contribution is. And if you realize how important that contribution is, what you want to do is to involve the surgeon from the very beginning so that he will not only provide the tissue, but also be involved in the conception and design, the drafting of the article, and so on. In other words, the way to become an author is to get involved in these things. And if you want to make someone an author, the solution does not lie in just putting his name in the list, but in making sure that he contributes in these proper ways. Okay? And the reason is when you contribute something important, it does not necessarily make you an author, because to be an author is to say something. In other words, to contribute enough to the paper and to accept responsibility. Okay? The surgeon, by his contribution alone initially, would not have said something in this way. So you may ask, what did the surgeon say if you publish the paper? And you will not be able to identify what he said there. Okay. Well, one has to, let me go back on this. One has to clarify a few things just to make sure we understand what authorship represents. We want to talk about attribution of credit. And that means, well, if you go historically, the author was originally seen as creator, as the author as somebody creating something. And then there were some things that changed so that the focus was on writing something. I mean, previously it was not so easy for people to be publishing, to be writing. For example, Einstein did not write so many papers. There are so many other people now who write more than Einstein published during his time. Okay? But of course, Einstein published the things that mattered. Okay? And he also was not just a writer, but a creator of some things. And then this thing came into the picture. When you had something created, there was somebody who purchased what you created, not only in the matter of journal articles, but in the matter of musical compositions and so on. So this has somehow created some issues. You know, when someone could purchase something, could buy something that you wrote, now you have the questions relating to intellectual property. Right? So we now have issues not only of being author, but of being owner of something after it has been created. But what we should not miss is always the matter of taking responsibility. In whatever way someone is an author, there should be the notion of taking responsibility, as we will understand as we proceed. We have talked about gift authorship previously, right? I'm sorry, the slides are not in proper order. But one of the things that are now required when people submit, when authors submit an article is this: the contribution of each author to a paper. In other words, if, say, the four of you were to submit an article to a biomedical journal, the four of you will have to indicate across your names the particular thing that you contributed to the paper. So you might say, you participated in conceptualization and design of the project. And she may say the same thing, but she maybe will say, well, she was primarily involved in the data gathering and then later on in the analysis of the data. Okay? So there are specific roles that you might have played, and you're supposed to report that when you submit the article for publication. You may have noticed that in some of the journals now, or in most of the journals, in many of the journals. Okay. So include the contribution of each author, and then, excuse me, in addition to that, the acknowledgement of other contributions. In other words, if the surgeon were not to be an author, you also will say there that Dr. So-and-so contributed to this work by providing the tissue in the manner that we required. Okay? So you have the acknowledgement of the contribution, but that does not necessarily mean that the contributor was an author at the same time. Okay? But also, when you submit, you need a statement that the procedures observed ethics committee requirements. If you're using human subjects, then the research should have been approved by an ethics committee, and therefore you declare that this was approved by an ethics committee. Also, that you complied with the Helsinki Declaration. The Helsinki Declaration being acknowledged as the international set of guidelines that apply to research involving human subjects. But also the guidelines on the care and use of animals, okay, which would have included something about the proper care of the mice in the case that we discussed earlier. Then there are some guidelines that apply to the protection of individual rights. For example, the following should be omitted, especially if you're publishing something about, say, patients in a study. If you are showing pictures, you should make sure that you do not show identifying information. So that's the reason why you sometimes see photos of patients with the face or part of the face blacked out. And if the persons could be identified, you do not show their photos. Otherwise, if you feel that it is necessary to show photos, you should get the informed consent of the human subjects. Okay. Okay, of course, when you talk about authorship, part of it will be about plagiarism, which refers to the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words, either without permission or without giving appropriate credit. It's not all the time that you need to get permission. Sometimes you just get a line or two, and if you do that, then you don't need to get the permission of the author. Just give appropriate credit. And in some cases, you've had university professors guilty of plagiarism in as many as 80 papers in some sciences, okay? In this case, in material science. And the reason why this particular scientist was so confident at first that he wouldn't get caught was that he thought people would not be looking at English journals and Russian journals at the same time. So his plagiarism involved translating papers from Russian into English. And he thought the world has not changed since so many years ago. But now it's so easy to catch acts of plagiarism, because if you don't even need well, you have special software on the internet nowadays. Now you have the plagiarism sites, so you can load a document, and the software will tell you where these words likely came from. Or you can just do a search in Google. You put an entire sentence there, and you can Google will tell you where this sentence can be found. So it's so easy to catch plagiarism nowadays. Well, I think we've gone through this. A study by Shapiro et al. Found that 62 of their 1,176 authors had made no substantial contributions to 6 major tasks. So this is about gift authorship. What they did was to look at so many papers that involved 1,176 authors, and they discovered that of those authors, at least 62 made no substantial contributions to the tasks mentioned. Remember the ICMJE criteria earlier on? They used that as a basis. They realized that gift authorship is a very common practice. But aside from gift authorship, there are questions concerning self-plagiarism or redundant publication. What does this mean? Okay, well, what does this mean, self-plagiarism? Self-plagiarism, when you publish something on your own, and then later on, you write another article, and in your article, you keep referring to your earlier work, and somebody realizes that you're not saying anything new, no? But you want to do it anyway because you want to you want to have a longer CV for your promotion. Okay? Now, of course, that's not correct. Okay? Or double counting again. What would double counting mean? You publish something, and then you don't self-plagiarize, but you publish the same thing in another journal. Would that be justified? There are actually some exceptions when that might be justified. But there is some controversy concerning the justification. Suppose, what about something like this? I publish a paper on a particular topic. Okay. I've actually had a request like this from someone who published in the Asian Bioethics Review. What the author did was publish in the Asian Bioethics Review. After some time, he came back to us and said, I have a request to publish this same article in this journal in my country. Okay. This publication is limited to my country and is going to be in this language, not English, but the language of my country. Now, not everybody in my country can understand English, in which the Asian Bioethics Review is published. So he said, that is the reason why I am requesting permission to publish the same article, not in English, but in this other language. And we thought hard about it. Finally, we realized that he was telling the truth. And by publishing the article again in the language of his country, he was contributing to knowledge in a way that did not intend plagiarism, because he sought our permission, and two, he intended to indicate in the republication in the second language that this was a translation from the original English. Okay. So we thought it was okay. And while it would have resulted in double counting, I mean, if he was to list it again in his CV, then it would have appeared as two articles, but provided he indicated that the second one was just a translation of the first, it would have been clear to people reading his CV, and there was no intent to deceive. Okay? What is important is that there is no attempt to deceive, and there is an effort to avoid deception. But there are other types of redundant publications. First one mentioned here is same data, new analysis. Okay? So you have the same data, the same basic data, but now you're saying, well, I think the analysis in that first article is not correct. We approach it on the basis of a different theory, and now we come to a different conclusion. Okay? So you have the same data to begin with, but there is a different interpretation of the same data. Now, that should not be regarded as the same publication. As a matter of fact, it will be very useful because it shows us precisely that even when you have the same data, sometimes you can come up with a different interpretation and a different conclusion. Okay? As long as you make a reference to the original publication, again, there is no attempt to deceive, and there is a new contribution to knowledge. Does that sound okay? Yeah. What about meta-analysis? What does it mean? Meta-analysis. You see some of these studies nowadays, especially in connection with some drugs. Okay, clinical trials, for example. You have a study comparing one drug and another drug in one journal, and then you have a study comparing drug 2 with drug 3 in another paper, or a study using the same drugs but a different population in another paper. Maybe the first one was in a population of whites, and this one in a population of Chinese, and then another study among Malays. Okay. Now you put together all of those results and try to come up with an overall interpretation. So you have a meta-analysis. You're looking at the same basic data, but putting them together and trying to see what results you can get out of the several studies. So again, you have new information that is useful. Translated materials, we talked about that. Full papers previously published as abstracts or posters, where the initial publication was merely an abstract or a poster, it makes sense to have an elaboration of that publication in a longer paper. What about simultaneous publication? Well, we talked about that in one of the examples. Okay, so the word redundant does not necessarily mean useless. Okay, when you come across a term, it could be redundant in a way that is useful. Okay. Okay. I'll skip these slides. I put in this slide just to show you what could happen if someone engages in plagiarism. If you're not afraid of committing an act of plagiarism, at least you might be afraid when you see an example like this. This is the British Medical Journal, one of the most popular medical publications, and you don't want to see your name there, right? Especially, well, ordinarily you want to see your name in the British Medical Journal, but you don't want to see your name published like this. But it could be if you were to commit an act of plagiarism. Okay. Have you heard of the term dual-use research? No. Now you have. Okay, what does that mean, dual-use? Dual-use research means exactly what the term suggests, that research about materials that could have dual use. So, dual-use research can provide knowledge, products, or technologies that could be misapplied to pose a threat to public health and safety, agriculture, plants, animals, the environment. But nowadays, actually, dual use is taken to refer to more harmful materials. We'll see an example later on. But it could refer to research, say, involving radioactive materials. Okay? If you have research involving radioactive materials, obviously, those radioactive materials for health purposes would probably refer to the use of those radioactive materials for some kind of treatment. Okay? But radioactive materials can also be used for harmful purposes. Okay? In other words, you do research to try to find out how or to what good it can be put. But while you're researching to determine for what good it can be used, others may use the same material to try to kill other people. Right? So you have the dual use possibility. Now, if you're studying about some pathogens, in other words, some material that can be used, no, I better, it's much easier if we go to the example later on. So we'll go back to these points later on. There are other terms that have been used to refer to invalid attribution of authorship, and this is one of them. Coercion authorship, for example, which is used to refer to giving authorship to an individual because he or she asserts that his or her position or actions demand authorship. Okay. Remember, we had an example, we made an example of someone who supervises the work in the laboratory, and he says he wants to be named as an author. So that's a kind of coercion authorship, which is also actually a matter of usurping authorship. You don't deserve to be an author, you usurp authority. Or unjustified acceptance of authorship. What does unjustified acceptance mean? You're offered the opportunity to be listed as an author, which should be great, isn't it? You're just playing, and your friend says, oh, come on, so you can be promoted, I'll put you in as an author also in my paper. Now, it's not as simple as that. As others have pointed out, if you really want to make someone an author, there should be no shortcuts to it. What you do is to get the person involved in the project enough for him to be really recognized as an author. Sometimes commentators use the term mutual support or admiration authorship. You know, just like in the laboratory of Dr. Dali, right? That's what they were referring to. The authors agreed to place each other's names on papers, even though one made no direct contributions. And then we mentioned ghostwriters. And among ghostwriters, you can have an organization choosing an individual who has a major influence on a paper. Remember the example about the pharmaceutical company? Or maybe, no. Some time ago, there was a case of a pharmaceutical company that hired ghost writers to write papers for them. Okay? But the ghostwriters were not actually going to be listed as authors. They were not going to be listed as authors because they were not university professors, they were not academics, they were just people from the pharmaceutical company who knew what had to be written in the report in order to promote the products. But actually, there are ghostwriters who are not like that. You can have a what is referred to here as a technical author. You know, the Prime Minister has to write a speech, but he doesn't have the time to be writing all of his speeches, right? Or the president of your country delivers a lot of speeches, maybe several speeches in one day. Can you imagine how much time will be required for him to write all the speeches that he has to deliver? So there is someone who writes the speeches for him. Okay. But that is not the same as a ghostwriter that we don't want here, because that ghostwriter, that speechwriter, does not try to be a ghost. In other words, he's not trying to hide an interest in much the same way that the pharmaceutical company ghostwriter tries to deceive people. Okay? Or you can have a supervised person directed to write significant portions of a paper. Well, actually, this is more appropriate for the Prime Minister's speechwriter. Okay? If I were Prime Minister and I have to deliver a speech on major policy, I do not just leave it to someone to write it. What I do is to talk to him and say, well, here's what I want to say. You execute. You write it out. But this is what we want to say here. Okay? Okay, so you have different types of ghostwriters. Oh, sorry, that's just repeating. Now we go and have a look at some cases. Are you tired and want a break? Do you need a break? Or we just continue and finish? Yeah. Okay, we'll just continue. Okay, these parts are now about some cases. First one about publishing a copyrighted figure. A postdoc fellow and his mentor have co-authored a paper as a preliminary report. I want to go back to that because it is about a figure. Imagine that is a figure. I mean, that's not their real figure, but imagine that that is the figure that they have published in a previous paper. To cut the long story short, what they want to do is to publish another paper with different materials except this graph. Okay. This graph is also going to be central to that other paper, but this has been published already. So what they intend to do is to publish this graph, but use a different color for the lines and make it thicker so it won't be the same graph. You get the point? This is copyrighted as a graph, okay, because it's been published. They published it, it's been copyrighted. They don't want to publish it again because this is the crucial graph. Okay? So what they do, so it won't be the same graph, is they change the color of the y and the x-axis, and they make the lines thicker, so it's not the same graph anymore. Or is it? Do you avoid the copyright infringement by changing how the graph looks? Yeah. Or suppose instead of the graph, you make it, say, a pie chart or a different kind of graph. Have you used the software for making graphs? Yeah. Imagine that you have options, right? Sometimes you say this kind of graph, so you just put the numbers and then the software, well, you can do it in PowerPoint actually, don't you sometimes? So you provide the figures, the numbers, and then PowerPoint gives you this graph. Then you don't want the way it looks. So you go back to the figures and say, okay, I want this other type of graph. Now it's not the same anymore, but it uses the same data, the same numbers, so it looks different. And you also have the option to change colors, right? In your PowerPoint presentation, in your PowerPoint slide. So instead of red and blue, you choose yellow and green for the X and Y axis. Is that a new graph already?
Is the purpose to reprint the graph is to avoid being recognized it is being published?
I think you hit the nail on the head by asking the question. And you use the word recognized, right? You're asking, is the purpose simply to prevent the graph from being recognized? Yeah. And obviously that is the purpose in changing the color or changing the appearance, right? But if that were the case, you don't actually create a new graph, right?
Because I think it is easy to recognize if we just change the color or the lines. It's easy to know that we still use the same graph. Or we can just reprint the graph and also cite it as the reference. Would that be okay?
Yeah, actually, they seem to be bothered unnecessarily, and you got the point. I mean, they don't have to be bothered because they're the ones who wrote the initial paper, and although this graph is copyrighted, it is their graph, it is the result of their work, right? Which means they can cite it, just refer to it, or just put the correct citation, and there should be no problems. Yeah. I think that's the main point behind the example, really. You don't have to try to conceal the graph because it is just a representation of your findings. And if this is truly a different paper, then you will be saying a different thing, although you will be using as a reference point the same graph that you already published in that earlier paper. As long as you're not hiding it, then it should be okay. And if you just try to conceal it by changing the color and so on, then you're just making things difficult for yourself. Okay? So it doesn't work that way. Okay, what about this next case called abuse of authorship? What happens here, well, this is a real case encountered by one journal editor. Okay. A 5-author manuscript, okay, this manuscript was submitted and it was approved. Oh, you're not seeing it yet. There's a manuscript written by 5 authors, and it was accepted for publication already. But after it was accepted for publication, the authors withdrew the publication to enable them, according to them, to patent a product described in the manuscript. Okay, so it was approved for publication already, but then withdrawn. because they needed to have the product approved, patented. When the manuscript was resubmitted, one of the authors had been replaced. So not the original 5, just the original 4 plus another one. When asked for an explanation, here is what the corresponding author said. The missing author in the resubmitted version was included in the original manuscript by mistake of the secretary who cut and pasted the list of authors from another paper. Okay? That was the explanation. And according to the explanation, this mistake was being corrected in the resubmitted version. But there was a problem because the missing author, the author who is now missing from the list of authors, had originally signed the author's declaration when the original was submitted. Now, he was the one who submitted the author's declaration, and also the copyright transfer before they went to press. Okay, so he was going to be the corresponding author in a way. But now his name is missing, which makes you suspect that they are not actually telling the truth. No? Do you get the point? How can that be a secretary's mistake? There was no trace of the new author in the files. No mention. They submitted this paper before, this new author who's listed now. There was no mention of his name. There was no acknowledgement of any kind of contribution. But when asked about this, the corresponding author again blamed the current corresponding author, again blamed his secretary for the mistake. Can you believe that? So the editor asked the corresponding author to indicate the specific contribution of the new author and to provide the email addresses of all authors. And when he was asked, the corresponding author no longer responded. Now, this is an example of a case that illustrates something very important for us, the case of Malcolm Pierce. Malcolm Pierce published 2 articles in one issue of the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, reporting on research results, the following. A case report on the embryo of an ectopic pregnancy being reimplanted and leading to a baby being born. Okay, so something that had never been done before. Because you have the embryo of an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy outside the uterus, being reimplanted in the uterus, and then leading to the baby being born. So this had never been done previously. In a trial sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, focusing on treatment of 200 women with polycystic ovary syndrome. Okay, polycystic ovary syndrome. But actually, the case described in the first paper didn't exist. And the trial described in the second paper had never taken place, and the sponsoring pharmaceutical company was just an invention. As a result, Malcolm Pierce was dismissed from his post, and his name was erased from the medical register. Okay? Well, a simple case of fabrication, right? But that's not all. Because Professor Jeffrey Chamberlain, head of the department where Pierce worked, had to resign from his post. Why? Because although he was not involved in the fabrication, he had accepted a gift authorship as co-author of one of the papers. Okay? I gave this example as an illustration of what could happen if one just accepts gift authorship. As I said, authorship, not gift authorship, but authorship has two components, contribution or credit and responsibility. You cannot just get the credit and then if something goes wrong, not accept responsibility. And this is one case where the two could not be separated. Okay? He got the credit, but when something went wrong, he also had to accept the blame for the publication. Okay? He knew nothing about it when he accepted the authorship. There was actually a similar case involving someone who was at that time the president, I think, of California Institute of Technology. So one of the prominent scientists in the United States. So he was the president of the university. And at that time also, one of his subordinates was doing research. And although this president of the university could not participate in the research because this was someone from his laboratory, he accepted a gift authorship. But later on, questions were raised about the research, and the research was shown to be or to involve a fabrication. And because of the fabrication, the president had to resign as president of that university. Why? Because he accepted the authorship. He couldn't dissociate the credit for the work from the responsibility. The following case, we'll have just one or two more cases. This one involves a government-funded archaeological excavation on city property. A scientist at Sunji Institute has recovered a 120-year-old diary. Okay, they have a digging in the city. The scientist recovers a 120-year-old diary containing identifiable sensitive data. The diary can potentially raise genealogical issues for descendants living in the area. So there are still some people who could be related to the person who wrote the diary. The scientist actually includes some of the data in the first draft manuscript. So he writes a manuscript about the results of the digging, and he includes some of the data in the first draft. And the city's Historical Society Museum has asked the scientists to display the artifacts, including some pages of the diary in the museum. While editing his draft, the scientist realizes that some of the people mentioned in the diary are significant contributors to Sunji Institute, to which he belongs. Now, here are some questions. One, who owns the diary? Who can be regarded as owner of the diary? Sorry? This is the slide before that. So it's a 120-year-old diary. Obviously, the writer of the diary, I mean the original owner, is dead. Okay. But there are references to people who are still living. And there will be questions about the disposition of the diary. So is it fair to ask who owns the diary? Is there an owner? I mean, aside from the original owner, is there an owner now? What if there's a grandson or a great-grandson? And there are references to the family in the diary. Can the grand or great-grandson be regarded somehow as an owner? Yes.
Without the diary from the expectation, does the diary's descendants will know that the diary is from their ancestors?
Without yes, it is possible. It is possible that if you reveal the information from the diary, the ancestors, not the ancestors, but the descendants can say, well, we are descendants of the original owner. Because there are specific descriptions in the diary.
Is it possible also the finder and the descendants both can claim their rights to the diary?
Do you think so?
Because without the scientist's effort, the diary cannot be found. But the diary also, the diary's owner's descendants also can claim that maybe the diary is their heritage or something else.
Yeah, as a family heritage. Right?
Yes.
Would the finder actually have a claim to ownership? I mean, if you go back, it's a government-funded archaeological excavation on city property. Does that have a significance? What would be the significance of that? Would that be, therefore, city property?
Because they have paid their efforts to try to find out the history of the diary and to check out the details about what's the owner and what's his era and what's his position, like that.
So you're telling us there seem to be two bases for making claims to the diary. Yeah, one is on the basis of the funding for the project, which is the city. Also the fact that it is being done on city property. But the second is the heritage. So two competing claims. Yeah? Well, I don't know the answer really. I mean, I don't have a ready answer, but this represents some of the issues that may arise in this kind of research. When you have scientific research, there may be some, while the description seems to call attention to privacy issues, okay, there will be issues of privacy also, because the diary may be referring to identifiable information that, say, has something to do with what if there is, because it is a diary, what if it is, say, about a sexual preference of the owner. Suppose the owner was, say, homosexual, and he has notes there about his homosexuality. Would that be a basis for treating it as a private account, and therefore something not to be divulged? Suppose there is a name there. So there is a name. And when you browse through the diary, there is something about homosexuality. If you have access to the content, what does that indicate for you? Suppose the name is the name of a former mayor of the city. Does it make a difference? What I'm saying in effect is that there are a lot of these factors that come into consideration, right? Like the questions that we had about the genetic case earlier on. I mean, I don't have ready answers for this. I'm saying it is a complicated thing. There are various claims, various considerations that need to be taken into account. Right? Okay, can I have just one more? Do you have time for one more case? Okay. This is about a blood bank. As director of a blood bank, you have been collecting and storing hundreds of frozen blood samples from donors in order to perform immunologic studies. Now, a geneticist colleague asks for access to some samples that you have. Okay, you direct a blood bank, obviously you have a lot of blood samples there, but these samples are usually not for research, but for something else. Okay? If there is a sick person who needs blood transfusion, then you can use the blood from that bank. But aside from that, you've been using this also for research, and there is a geneticist colleague who asked for access to some samples to examine the prevalence of mutations in several genes. Under what conditions, if any, would you release samples for such purposes? Yeah.
Informed consent of the blood donor.
Does it depend on the informed consent?
I mean that I'm not really sure about the purpose of the blood bank. So is it only medical use, or because you mentioned some studies, so maybe the blood donor knows that is informed of taking his blood for other researches. I think under this condition, the, the director of the blood bank can release the sample for genetics as research use, for research use.
Okay. There have been a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of discussion concerning cases like this, because when you have a large collection of blood or of other genetic samples, usually scientists will start to see the research potential, and therefore will try to look for ways of making use of the material. A basic requirement usually is that if at all, the samples to be used should be unidentified or anonymized. Okay? Okay, you can use them for research provided you disengage the identity from the samples. Okay? But there is also another issue that is usually related to samples of this type, which is, as you mentioned, consent. Okay? It is not enough that you separate the identity from the samples, because even if they have been dissociated, the owner of the sample might in the first place have said, okay, I want to contribute this for transfusion, but not for research. So if that is the case, then you cannot use it for research, even if you separate the identity. But there is another issue still, which is there is consent, but informed consent suggests you know what it is going to be used for, or what kind of research it is going to be used for. But if you don't know the specific type of research, because this geneticist has just come to you to ask for permission, that means the owner of the sample didn't know about this genetic researcher. So the owner could not have been properly informed of the use of this sample. So there is no informed consent. Right? But some people say, well, with science nowadays, you really cannot anticipate all of the types of researches that will become important. So if someone says, okay, you use it for research, that should be good enough. But that is still something that is being debated. Okay? So some people say, you can use it. I just donate it for whatever use, you use it. Okay? But someone can imagine some purposes for which it might be used that the person simply does not fully comprehend. What if the blood is used to try to construct a type of human being that has 4 horns and 2 tails, things like that? I mean, that of course is not likely. I'm just trying to imagine a possibility that is so gross for human beings that later on, even if they said yes, they will say, oh, I did not understand that they would think of using it for something like that. Okay? So there is still some discussion concerning matters of that type. So people talk about blanket consent, or general consent for genetic research, because genetic research can be of so many different types that it is impossible almost to provide full information before getting the consent. So scientists talk about blanket consent or general consent, and there is debate concerning that. In other words, although people might give blanket consent, it seems to be still useful to have some type of oversight just to consider those wild cases that people nowadays might not be capable of imagining. Okay? So that's it for today. Are you tired?